The notification didn't arrive with a bang. It arrived with a collective gasp that rippled across the city at exactly 10:14 p.m. on a Tuesday night that would rewrite 2 lives forever. A link was blasted from an untraceable server to every major social circle, every high-rise boardroom, every tabloid editor with a pulse and a platform. The subject line was simple, clinical, devastating. The king's hidden debt. Within seconds, the link was clicked, shared, screenshotted, and weaponized. Vance Sterling, the billionaire CEO of Sterling Global, a man whose face was the blueprint for modern success, found himself staring at a screen flickering with a grainy night vision feed of his own penthouse, his private sanctuary, his fortress. And there, in the center of the frame, was a moment of absolute, unshielded vulnerability between him and Zoe Hartley, the woman who arrived at 4 o'clock every morning to scrub the marble floors she was never supposed to stand on as anything other than invisible. The caption beneath the video read, "The King's Hidden Debt." Within seconds, Zoe's face, a face that had spent years in the shadows, became the most hunted image in the country. Before we go any further, if stories like this one, stories that reveal the truth about power, dignity, and what it means to fight for love when the world tells you you're not worthy, resonate with you, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story that inspires. And after you hear how this unfolds, drop your thoughts in the comments. Share your perspective. You never know who needs to hear your story today. Because that's what we do here. We don't just tell stories. We build a community that believes everyone, no matter where they start, deserves to be seen. Vance Sterling was a man defined by control. After losing his wife, Elena, in a tragic car accident 6 years earlier, he had raised his son, Leo, with a discipline that bordered on cold. He was a billionaire widower who believed that vulnerability was a structural flaw, that emotions were liabilities on a balance sheet, and that love was a luxury he could no longer afford. He didn't want a companion. He wanted a fortress. He wanted walls so high that nothing could ever hurt him or his son again. His penthouse on the 60th floor was a monument to that philosophy. Glass, steel, marble. Everything clean, everything controlled, everything empty. The morning after Elena's funeral, Vance had stood in the middle of that penthouse and made himself a promise. He would never let grief control him again. He would never let anyone close enough to leave a wound. He would build an empire that couldn't crumble, raise a son who wouldn't need anyone, and live a life where pain was a variable he could eliminate with enough strategy and discipline. Leo was 6 years old now, a quiet boy with his mother's dark eyes and his father's careful way of watching the world. Vance loved his son with a ferocity that terrified him, but he didn't know how to show it without feeling like he was exposing them both to danger. So he showed it through structure. Bedtime at 8, homework before play, no sweets during the week, piano lessons on Tuesdays, soccer on Thursdays. Everything scheduled, everything predictable, everything safe. Leo never complained. He was a good kid. But sometimes Vance would catch him staring out the window at the city below, and he wondered if his son was lonely in the same way he was. He wondered if Leo remembered his mother's laugh, or if 6 years was long enough to erase the sound of it. Then there was Zoe Hartley, a former medical student who had walked away from her dreams to care for her younger brother Miles after their parents were killed in a house fire when she was 21 and he was 12. The fire had started in the middle of the night, an electrical fault in the walls of the old house they'd grown up in. Zoe had been away at college, 3 hours north, studying for her anatomy final. Miles had called her at 2 in the morning, his voice shaking. "So, the house is on fire. Mom and Dad won't wake up." She had driven through the night, breaking every speed limit, praying to a God she wasn't sure she believed in. By the time she arrived, the house was a black skeleton against the dawn sky. Her parents were gone. Miles was in the hospital with smoke inhalation and second-degree burns on his hands from trying to pull them out. The scholarship she'd worked 3 jobs to earn didn't cover grief. It didn't cover funeral costs or a 12-year-old brother who woke up screaming every night. So she'd walked away from medical school, packed up what was left of their lives, and moved to the city where no one knew their story. She didn't clean for a living. She fought for a living. Every mop bucket was a round in the ring. Every shift was a strategy to keep Miles in school, to keep the lights on, to keep the dream alive that one day, maybe, she'd finish her degree and become the doctor her parents had believed she could be. She worked 3 cleaning jobs, all of them in buildings where people like her were meant to be invisible. She arrived before the sun. She left before the world woke up. She existed in the margins of other people's lives, and that's exactly where she wanted to stay. It was safer that way, easier. She had learned that people didn't see you if you didn't give them a reason to look. Vance's penthouse was her favorite job, even though she'd never admit it. It was quiet, peaceful, the kind of place where she could think without anyone asking her questions or expecting her to be anything other than efficient. She'd been cleaning it for 2 years, and in all that time, she'd only seen Vance Sterling in person maybe a dozen times. He was always polite, always distant, always in a hurry. He'd nod at her, sometimes say good morning, and then disappear into his office or out the door. She liked it that way. She didn't need to be seen. She just needed the paycheck. But there were small moments, tiny cracks in the routine where she'd catch a glimpse of something else. Like the morning she'd found Leo sitting at the kitchen counter, crying quietly over a bowl of cereal because he'd forgotten to do his spelling homework. Vance had been on a conference call in the other room, his voice sharp and commanding, completely unaware. Zoe had knelt down next to Leo, whispered that she'd help him finish it before school, and watched the relief flood his face. Or the night she'd stayed late to deep clean the library and found a framed photo of a woman who must have been Elena, tucked away on a shelf behind a stack of books, like Vance couldn't bear to look at it, but couldn't bring himself to put it away either. She'd dusted the frame carefully, gently, and put it back exactly where she'd found it. The night that changed everything wasn't a product of lust. It wasn't a calculated move or a desperate grasp for something she couldn't have. It was a product of a shared breaking point. One night, after Vance returned from a brutal board meeting where investors had questioned his leadership, where analysts had whispered that a widower raising a child alone wasn't the image Sterling Global needed, he came home to find Zoe in the library, wiping tears from her face as she stared at a framed photograph of 2 people who looked like they could have been her parents. He should have walked past. He should have given her privacy. But something in the way she was crying, quiet and controlled, like she was trying not to take up too much space even in her own grief, made him stop. He didn't ask her to leave. He poured her a glass of bourbon from the crystal decanter on the shelf, poured one for himself, and sat down in the chair across from her. They talked, not as billionaire and cleaner, but as 2 people drowning in grief and loneliness and the unbearable weight of being strong for everyone else. Vance opened up about Elena, about the guilt of moving forward, about the terror of raising Leo alone and getting it wrong. He told her about the board meeting, about the whispers that he wasn't stable, that a man his age should remarry for appearances, that a child needed a mother. He told her things he'd never said out loud, not even to his therapist. Zoe shared her story. The scholarship she lost when her parents died. The brother she was raising. The dream deferred. She told him about the night of the fire, about the sound of Miles's voice on the phone, about the way her mother's wedding ring had melted into a misshapen lump of gold that she kept in a box under her bed because she couldn't bring herself to throw it away. She told him about the mornings when she woke up and forgot, just for a second, that they were gone, and how that second of forgetting was worse than the grief itself. The conversation turned into hours. The bourbon turned into laughter, then silence. Then something neither of them had planned. It wasn't lust. It was two broken people finally feeling human. It was the first time in 6 years that Vance had let someone see him without the armor. It was the first time in 4 years that Zoe had let herself want something that wasn't about survival. When morning came, the sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, turning the city gold. Zoe gathered her things quietly, her hands shaking slightly as she buttoned her coat. Vance watched her from the doorway, knowing he should say something, but not knowing what. She paused at the door, looked back at him, and for a moment it seemed like she might speak. But she didn't. She just left. And Vance stood there in the empty penthouse, surrounded by glass and steel and silence, and realized he'd just made the first real mistake of his carefully controlled life. 3 weeks passed. They didn't speak about that night. They existed in careful orbits, polite and distant and aching. Zoe arrived at 4 a.m. like always. Vance left for the office before she finished, like always. But everything had changed. When Zoe cleaned the library now, she could feel the ghost of that conversation in every corner. When Vance came home at night, he'd find himself looking for signs that she'd been there. A window opened slightly, the scent of lemon cleaner. A book moved an inch to the left. Small things that meant she was real, that the night had been real, that he hadn't imagined the only moment of peace he'd felt in 6 years. But in the penthouse security room, 60 floors below in the basement of the building, a red recording light had been blinking silently in the dark. Someone had been watching. Someone had been waiting. And now, someone had everything they needed. Her name was Sloane Craven, and she was the kind of woman who treated people like assets and relationships like hostile takeovers. Sloane was Vance's ex-fiancée, a high society powerhouse who had been waiting for Vance to return to his senses and marry her so they could merge their two empires into something unstoppable. She came from old money, the kind that whispered instead of shouted, the kind that opened doors before you even knocked. Her family owned half the commercial real estate in the city, and she'd been groomed from birth to expand that empire through strategic marriages and ruthless business deals. Vance had been the perfect target, young, brilliant, hungry. When they'd met at a fundraiser 8 years ago, she'd seen his potential immediately. She'd pursued him with the same focus she applied to quarterly earnings reports. They'd dated for 2 years. She'd pushed for marriage. He'd hesitated. Then Elena had walked into his life at a tech conference in San Francisco, and everything Sloane had built had crumbled overnight. To Sloane, Vance's rejection wasn't a heartbreak. It was a brand insult. She had stood in front of 500 people at a charity gala 2 years after Elena's death and proposed to him in front of cameras, investors, and every media outlet that mattered. She'd calculated it perfectly. Enough time had passed. Vance was single. Leo needed a mother figure. Their companies would be unstoppable together. It was logical. It was strategic. It was perfect. And Vance had looked at her with something close to pity and said no. Not now, Sloane. Not ever. The room had gone silent. Cameras had flashed. By morning, the rejection was headline news. Sloane Craven, the woman who never lost, had lost on national television. The humiliation was a wound that never healed. It festered. It turned into something dark and deliberate. For 2 years, Sloane had been waiting for the right moment to remind Vance what it felt like to be humiliated. She'd tried subtle approaches first, planting stories in the press about Sterling Global's vulnerabilities, poaching his top executives, undercutting his bids on major contracts. But nothing stuck. Vance was too smart, too careful, too controlled. So she'd decided to go deeper. She needed something personal, something that would crack the fortress he'd built around himself. Sloane's revenge strategy wasn't impulsive, it was surgical. She had bribed Marcus Webb, the head of building security, to tap into the penthouse's secondary security feed, the one Vance didn't even know existed because it was supposed to be deactivated after Elena's death. Marcus had been desperate. His 16-year-old daughter Claire needed surgery for a rare heart condition that insurance wouldn't cover. The bills were crushing him. When Sloane had approached him in the parking garage one night, briefcase in hand, he'd wanted to say no. He'd wanted to walk away. But then she'd opened the briefcase and shown him $50,000 in cash, and all he could think about was Claire's face when the doctor said they couldn't operate without payment up front. All he had to do was give Sloane access to the secondary feed. All he had to do was look the other way. Sloane didn't just want to shame Vance. She wanted to annihilate the woman she saw as nothing more than help. Her logic was brutal and efficient. If she leaked the tape, Vance would be forced to distance himself from Zoe to save his company's stock, and Zoe would be crushed by the weight of the scandal. The cleaner would disappear back into the shadows where she belonged, and Vance would realize that trying to move on with someone beneath him was a mistake that cost him everything. Then, when he was broken and desperate, Sloane would be there. And this time, he'd say yes. The plan was perfect. Sloane had spent weeks reviewing the footage, waiting for the right moment, and then she'd found it. The night in the library, the bourbon, the conversation, the way Vance had looked at Zoe like she was the only real thing in his carefully constructed world. It was everything Sloane needed. On a Tuesday night, Sloane uploaded the video to an untraceable server. She wrote the caption herself. The King's Hidden Debt. She wanted it to sound like an expose, like journalism, like the public had a right to know. Her finger hovered over the send button. She thought of Vance's face when he realized his empire was crumbling. She thought of Zoe's face when the world turned on her. She smiled. She clicked send. The clock read 10:14 p.m. Vance was in his home office reviewing quarterly reports when his phone exploded with notifications. Calls from board members, investors, his PR team, his legal counsel. Text messages that didn't make sense. Stock alerts showing Sterling Global in free fall. He opened the link someone had sent and saw himself and Zoe in the penthouse library, the night that was supposed to stay private. The night that had meant something. The feed was grainy, the angle awkward, but it was unmistakable. His first thought wasn't the stock price or the headlines or the damage control. His first thought was Zoe. He tried to call her. No answer. He tried again. Voicemail. He stood up, grabbed his keys, and headed for the door. Leo was asleep upstairs. He told the nanny there was an emergency and he'd be back within the hour. He had to find Zoe before she saw it. He had to explain. He had to protect her. But he was already too late. Miles away, in a cramped one-bedroom apartment with peeling paint and a leaking ceiling, Zoe was helping Miles with his math homework when her phone started buzzing. Text after text, notification after notification, all from unknown numbers. She frowned, picked up the phone, and felt her stomach drop. The messages were vicious. You're a disgusting parasite, gold-digging trash. A screenshot of her face with the word whore scrawled across it in red. Her hands started shaking. Miles looked up from his homework, his pencil hovering over the page. So, what's wrong? She couldn't speak. She stood up, walked to the bathroom, and locked the door. Her phone rang. Unknown number. She answered without thinking. A reporter's voice, sharp and hungry, cut through the static. Miss Hartley, how long have you been having an affair with Vance Sterling? Did you plan this to extort him? Are you aware that his company's stock has dropped 12% in the last hour? Do you have any comment?" She hung up and looked at herself in the mirror. Her reflection was a stranger. Outside, she heard car doors slamming. She pulled back the curtain an inch and saw them. Paparazzi, cameras, vans with satellite dishes. They had found her apartment. They were setting up camp on the sidewalk like she was a celebrity, like her life was entertainment. She was trapped. Miles knocked on the bathroom door. "So there are people outside. They're asking about you. What's going on?" She opened the door and saw the fear in his eyes, the same fear he'd had the night of the fire. And something inside her broke. The fallout was a psychological massacre. Within 2 hours, Zoe's phone was a weapon of mass destruction. Death threats, doxing, her address posted online. Photos of Miles's school being shared with captions like, "This is where the gold digger's brother goes to school." Someone posted her work schedule. Someone else posted a photo of her parents' graves with the caption, "At least they didn't live to see what you became." Zoe couldn't leave her apartment. Paparazzi camped outside her door, shouting questions every time she came near a window. She watched the news, each headline a knife. Sterling Global CEO in sex scandal with cleaning staff. Billionaire's secret affair with employee exposed. Legal analysts speculated that Vance would file a restraining order to protect his company. It was a lie, planted by Sloane's PR team, but Zoe didn't know that. She believed every word. She believed she had destroyed Vance's legacy, endangered Leo, ruined her brother's future. Miles sat on the couch, his face pale, staring at his phone. "They're saying terrible things about you, Zoe. They're saying you're a liar, that you're trying to steal his money." She took the phone from his hands and turned it off. She turned off her own phone. The silence was worse than the noise. She sat on the edge of her bed and stared at the wall. She thought about Miles. She thought about the life he deserved, the life he wouldn't have because of her. She thought about the medical degree she'd never finish, the parents she'd never see again, the dream that had died the night of the fire and was now being buried under an avalanche of hate she'd never escape. She wrote a note on a piece of notebook paper. "I'm sorry. You deserved better than me." She left it on the kitchen counter where Miles would find it. She grabbed her coat and walked into the rain. The paparazzi shouted questions as she pushed through them, but she didn't hear the words. She just walked and walked and walked. While the world thought Vance was in crisis mode, hiding behind lawyers and PR teams, he was in his private server room on the 59th floor, tearing through security logs with the fury of a man who had just realized his fortress had become a cage. He didn't care about the stock price. He cared about finding who had leaked the tape and making them pay. He cared about finding Zoe. It took him 4 hours, 3 pots of coffee, and a digital forensics expert he flew in from Berlin on his private jet, but he found it. The breach had come from an internal security override. Someone with administrative access. Someone who knew the system. He pulled up the access logs and saw the name. Marcus Webb, head of building security. The man Vance had trusted for 5 years. He confronted Marcus in the security office at 3 in the morning. Marcus was sitting at his desk staring at a photo of his daughter when Vance walked in and locked the door behind him. Marcus looked up and the guilt was written all over his face. Vance didn't yell. He didn't need to. He just stood there, waiting. Marcus cracked within minutes. He told Vance everything. Sloane's offer, the $50,000, his daughter's surgery, the secondary feed that was never supposed to be active. Vance listened, his jaw tight, his hands clenched. When Marcus finished, Vance leaned forward and spoke in a voice that could cut glass. "You sold her out for what? A bonus?" Marcus shook his head, tears streaming down his face. My daughter was dying. I didn't have a choice. Vance stared at him for a long moment. Then he stood up and walked toward the door. Before he left, he turned back. You always have a choice, Marcus. You just made the wrong one. But Vance's priority wasn't revenge. It was finding Zoe. He called her phone. No answer. He went to her apartment. The paparazzi were still there, but she was gone. He knocked on the door. Miles answered, his eyes red from crying. Where is she? Miles shook his head. I don't know. She left a note. She said she was sorry. Panic set in. The kind of panic that makes a man who controls billions realize he controls nothing. He grabbed Miles by the shoulders, tried to stay calm. When did she leave? How long ago? Miles checked his phone. Maybe 40 minutes? Vance's mind raced. 40 minutes. She could be anywhere. Then Leo, his 6-year-old son, who had been waiting in the car downstairs with the driver, called his cell phone. Daddy, why is Zoe's superhero light moving? Vance froze. What? Leo's voice was small, confused. The superhero light. The one she gave me. It's moving on my tablet. Vance's heart stopped. The GPS tracker. 6 months ago, Zoe had given Leo a superhero keychain with a GPS tracker built in, one of those devices parents use to keep track of their kids. She'd told Leo it was so he'd always be safe, so she'd always know where he was if he needed her. And she'd kept the matching one. Vance sprinted back to the car, grabbed Leo's tablet, and opened the tracking app. Her location flashed on the screen. The city bridge. His blood ran cold. Vance's car tore through the rain-slicked streets, the speedometer climbing past 90, past 100. The GPS showed Zoe hadn't moved in 3 minutes. He was still 5 minutes away. His hands gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. The rain was coming down in sheets, the windshield wipers barely keeping up. Don't do it, Zoe. Please, don't do it. He thought about the night in the library, the way she'd looked at him like he was human, like he mattered. He thought about the way she'd helped Leo with his homework, the way she'd dusted Elena's photo with such care. He thought about the fact that he'd let her walk out that door 3 weeks ago without saying a word. And now she was standing on a bridge in the rain because the world had turned her into a monster for the crime of being kind to him. He arrived at the bridge and saw her on the railing, her body swaying in the wind, her coat soaked through, her hair plastered to her face. The river churned black and violent 60 feet below. He didn't call for police. He didn't call for backup. He ran toward her, his dress shoes slipping on the wet pavement, shouting her name over the roar of the storm. Zoe, look at me! She turned, and her face was a portrait of devastation. Tears mixed with rain. Her voice was barely audible over the wind. You should have left me in the shadows, Vance. They're going to take your company. They're going to take Leo. Because of me? Vance didn't hesitate. He climbed over the railing and stepped onto the narrow ledge beside her, his $1,000 suit soaking through, his shoes slipping on wet metal. The drop yawned beneath them. They can take the towers, Zoe. Let them burn the steel. I don't care. She stared at him, disbelief and hope warring in her eyes. What are you doing? Get down, you're going to fall. He didn't move. He didn't reach for her with money. He didn't reach for her with promises. He reached for her with his trembling, rain-soaked hand. I've spent 10 years building things that can't love me back. I've spent 6 years hiding from the only thing that matters. If you jump, I'm jumping too. Because I'm done living in a world where I have to apologize for being happy. Zoe's voice cracked, the words coming out in broken sobs. What if I'm not worth it, Vance? What if I ruin you? What if everything they're saying is true? Vance's answer was a whisper that cut through the storm like a blade. Then we'll be ruined together. And I'd rather be ruined with you than perfect without you. Her hand reached out, shaking, uncertain. Their fingers touched. She grabbed his wrist. Vance pulled her off the railing and into his arms with a force that nearly sent them both tumbling backward. They collapsed onto the wet pavement, holding each other as the rain poured down, as the traffic roared past, as the city lights blurred into watercolor streaks. Zoe sobbed into his chest, and Vance held her like she was the only thing keeping him tethered to the earth. In the distance, a camera flash went off. Someone was always watching. But for the first time in 6 years, Vance Sterling didn't care. The next morning, Vance didn't hide. He didn't issue a statement through his PR team. He didn't let his lawyers do the talking. He walked into the Sterling Global boardroom at 9 a.m. with Zoe on his arm, her hair still damp from the rain, her eyes red but defiant. The board members were already seated, their faces ranging from shock to outrage to carefully controlled neutrality. Sloane was sitting at the head of the table, perfectly composed in a tailored navy suit, prepared to offer her sympathy, her support, her carefully calculated path back into Vance's life. She smiled when he walked in, the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Vance, I'm so glad you're here. We've been discussing options for damage control. I think if we issue a joint statement clarifying that this was an unfortunate misunderstanding, we can begin to rebuild your image and stabilize the stock." Vance didn't speak at first. He walked to the head of the table and slid a tablet across the polished surface to Sloane. It wasn't the leaked video. It was a digital trail. Bank transfers from Sloane's offshore account to Marcus Webb's personal account. $50,000, dated 2 days before the video went live. Time-stamped emails between Sloane and a media contact discussing the best time to release the story for maximum impact. Recorded phone calls between Sloane and Marcus, her voice cold and transactional as she gave him instructions on how to access the secondary feed. Lazone's face drained of color. The room held its breath. One of the board members leaned forward, scrolling through the evidence on the tablet. "Is this real?" Vance's voice was lethal and calm. "Every word of it. You always said I should be more transparent, Sloane. So here's my transparency. You tried to destroy an innocent woman to salvage your ego." He leaned close to her, close enough that only she could hear the next words. "The tape didn't ruin me. It showed me who my enemies were, and it showed the world exactly who I'm willing to protect." Sloane stood up, her hands shaking with rage. "You think you can prove this? You think anyone will care?" Vance straightened, looked around the table at the board members who had built their fortunes on his vision. "I don't need to prove it. I just did. The board has a choice. They can stand with someone who weaponizes people's private lives for revenge, or they can stand with integrity." The board voted unanimously to remove Sloane from all partnerships with Sterling Global. Her seat on the advisory board was revoked. Her consulting contracts were terminated. Security was called. As 2 guards escorted her out, Sloane stopped in front of Zoe and hissed under her breath, her voice dripping with venom. "You think this is over? You have no idea what you've started." Zoe looked her in the eye and spoke for the first time since entering the room. "I didn't start anything. You did. And you lost." Vance turned to the board. "If anyone here has a problem with Zoe, with my choices, with my life, you can leave with Sloane." No one moved. The room was silent except for the sound of Sloane's heels clicking down the hallway, fading into nothing. 1 year later, the penthouse was no longer a cold museum of glass and steel. It was a home. Toys were scattered on the floor, the smell of coffee and something baking filled the air. Laughter echoed off the walls. Zoe was finishing her medical degree, funded by a scholarship Vance had started for underprivileged students who had been forced to defer their dreams because of tragedy. The scholarship was named after her parents. She was top of her class. Leo called her Zoe Mom now, and she didn't correct him. Vance and Zoe hadn't ended up together because of a fairy tale. They had fought through fire and chosen each other every single day after. There were quiet nights when Zoe still had nightmares about the bridge, when she woke up gasping, convinced she was falling, and Vance held her until she fell back asleep, whispering that he had her, that she was safe, that she wasn't alone. There were mornings when Vance doubted himself as a father, as a partner, and Zoe reminded him that love wasn't about perfection. It was about showing up. They were a family now. Imperfect, scarred, but real. But the federal investigation into Vance's late wife's father had uncovered something that turned their relief into dread. The surveillance hadn't been just about Sloane's jealousy. It had been part of a decade-long scheme to control Vance's company through blackmail and manipulation. Vance's father-in-law, a man named Richard Calloway, had never forgiven Vance for taking Elena away from the family business and into a world Richard couldn't control. Elena had been Richard's only child, groomed from birth to take over Calloway Industries. When she'd met Vance and chosen love over legacy, Richard had seen it as the ultimate betrayal. When Elena died in the car accident, Richard had seen an opportunity. If he could destabilize Vance, if he could create chaos, he could swoop in, take custody of Leo, and reclaim control of Sterling Global through his grandson. The security breach hadn't started with Sloane. It had started the night Elena died. Someone had been watching Vance for 10 years, cataloging his movements, his relationships, his vulnerabilities, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. A letter arrived at the penthouse one morning addressed to Zoe in handwriting that looked like it belonged in another century. Inside was a single photograph of her and Vance on the bridge, taken the night he pulled her back from the edge. The angle was close, intimate, like the photographer had been standing just feet away. On the back, in careful script, were the words, "You saved him once. Can you do it again?" Zoe showed the letter to Vance. His face went pale. He opened his laptop to a secure message from Agent Morrison, the federal investigator assigned to the case. "We've traced the original security breach. It didn't start with Sloane Craven. It started the night your wife died. Someone's been watching you for 10 years. Richard Calloway has been funding a network of surveillance on you, your son, and now Miss Hartley. We believe he's planning something, but we don't know what yet. Stay vigilant." Zoe and Vance exchanged a look across the kitchen table. Leo was in the other room, building a tower out of blocks, laughing at something only a 6-year-old could find hilarious. The conspiracy wasn't over. It was just beginning. But this time, they weren't alone. This time, they were ready. Because they had learned something that no amount of money or power could teach. Dignity is not a job title. Zoe's value hadn't changed because she held a mop. Her mind, her heart, her strength had always been the prize. Vance had just been smart enough to see it when the rest of the world refused to look. Integrity is the only real fortress. Wealth didn't protect Vance. His willingness to lose it all for the truth did. And love, real love, is a choice you make in the fire, not in the safety of the shore. Vance reached across the table and took Zoe's hand. She squeezed back. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Because the truth was simple. The world had tried to destroy them. The world had failed. And now, the world was about to learn what happens when you underestimate the power of two people who refuse to let go. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that your worth isn't determined by your job title or your bank account, that real love is built in the hardest moments, not the easiest ones, then make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications. Because stories like this, stories that inspire and challenge and remind us what it means to fight for what matters, are what we're all about. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Share your perspective. You never know who needs to hear your voice today. Let's build a community that believes everyone deserves to be seen, to be valued, to be loved. See you in the next one.